When creativity is part of your job, repetition starts to feel a little dangerous. So I started paying attention to it. Hi, my name is Taylor, and as a yarn dyer, I spend a lot of time working with color. And there's this pattern I've noticed in my work for quite a while now, this tendency to arrive at similar kinds of palettes even when I feel like I'm branching out. And it wasn't until very recently that I decided to try to interrogate it a little more closely and figure out what's actually happening there. It had been sitting in the background for a while. Putting colors together started to seem almost too easy, and not in a satisfying way. The choices would come quickly, but they also carried a little bit of a familiarity that started to make me a little nervous. I kept landing in similar places, similar palettes, similar tones, similar values, similar hues, similar moods. Quick side note to tell you, it is Take Your Son or Daughter to Work Day, and this is Ronan. He is my 8-year-old, and he's here with me today. He's actually editing over there, right off camera, with some headphones, his own little stop motion movie, which I will show you in the after show of this episode.
And can I be in it?
Yeah. Now, what finally became clear to me is that I wasn't just repeating myself randomly. The outcome changed depending on how I arrived at the palette. Now, just to give you a little bit of background of how I go about color with Fiber for the People, which is my hand-dyed yarn business, I tend to dye my yarn in palettes, meaning that the skeins are solid colors and all of the colors form an overall palette. For example, I have yarn in my shop this weekend, and I have a few different palettes going into the shop this weekend, and this is one of them. And it's always 6 colors per palette, and this is one of those palettes here. Okay, so when I design color palettes for my shop, like the one that you see here, typically, well, I don't even know if you could qualify this as typically, but a lot of the time, I pull from inspiration, okay? So it could be any kind of visual or non-visual contextual inspiration that drives my color palette. However, I don't always work from some kind of visual or contextual inspiration. Sometimes I simply go for things like little embroidery flosses, and I put together color palettes from these. I pull things out and I lay them out in front of me until I find a color palette that strikes my fancy. And that is how I arrived at this color palette that I just popped up in front of you. And what I know about this color palette is that though the individual hues might be different than ones I've done in the past in terms of vibrancy or saturation or value, they all are within a similar color family. This is one of those palettes that, even though I think it's beautiful, it is one that I tend to land on in some way, shape, or form often when I'm left to my own devices and I'm just picking at little colors out of a jar, so to say. However, like I said, when I work from a very, tangible or visual form of inspiration, it does feel much more expansive. It could be a landscape, it could be a photograph, it could be a photograph of a landscape, it could be a book cover of a book I've recently finished, or even something less obviously visual like a character from a story I've read. In those situations, palettes that I would arrive at felt a little bit more specific and a little less predictable. They seemed to carry a point of view that did not originate from my usual color preferences. If that's the case, I wouldn't simply be choosing colors out of a bin that I just enjoy and think look nice together. I'm responding to tone, atmosphere, setting, and the mental imagery that forms while you're reading. Even without a literal image to inform me, there is already a shape to the decision. Once that shape is there, I feel like my choices start to move differently as it relates to how I build out a colorway collection for my yarn shop. I reach for colors I wouldn't normally choose, and the palette begins to feel more guided instead of merely assembled. There's already visual structure there. My job is no longer to invent an entire colorway system out of thin air. My job is to notice what is happening and to translate it into another medium. That changes the nature of the work. When I approach color palettes without that kind of reference, the experience changes. I think a part of the issue lives inside the idea of working from scratch. In fact, this was something, as I was thinking about this and putting this video together, I kept thinking about, well, It happens when I work from scratch. Those are the words that I would use. If I'm working from scratch at developing a color palette, and I refer to this as working from scratch. Or if you had colored pencils and you were just sketching out color palettes, working from scratch, no external inspiration. It sounds ideal. It sounds free, original, and deeply creative. It also sounds slightly virtuous, which should always make us a little suspicious. In practice though, working from scratch only works as well as the structure living inside your head will allow. When I build a palette without an external source to respond to, I'm still leaning on something. I'm drawing from experience. I'm drawing from combinations I've seen work in the past, from those color relationships that already feel trustworthy in a way. All the design decisions belong to me. I have to generate the relationships, manage the contrast, establish the color hierarchy, and then hold the whole thing together in a way that's cohesive. And that's not a flaw, it's just limited by the depth of the framework that I bring to the table. And when there's not enough structure to support exploration, my brain does what any sensible system would do. It reaches for what it already trusts. And this isn't just because I'm a yarn dyer. This could be for anybody that works with color or putting things together in a way that's cohesive. I mean, a graphic designer, an interior decorator, somebody who's just trying to put together colors for a really lovely colorwork yoke on a sweater. It's a heavier cognitive load than it sounds, especially if I'm also trying to surprise myself. When I compare this to some of my colorway collections from the fall, when I was working from very distinct sources of inspiration, whether they were book covers, whether they were characters from stories, or whether they were landscapes in my region of the United States, there was something about those palettes that felt so much more expansive and original to me. While these, where I'm not working from any kind of external source of inspiration, but really pulling from just out of context color samples, felt more narrow, felt more predictable, even when the materials themselves hadn't changed. One of the first ideas that helped clarify this is the idea of predictive processing. At its simplest, it suggests that the brain is always trying to predict outcomes based on past experience. It builds models of what tends to work, and then it leans on those models and that schema when new decisions show up. So when you sit down to make a creative choice, you're not starting from zero. You're starting from memory, from exposure, from repetition, and every preference that's been reinforced enough times to feel reliable. Once I started thinking about it that way, a lot of this started to make sense. And this takes me back to when I was teaching elementary school, and we talked a lot about developing the student's schema. Your schema is essentially your background knowledge, and it is following us everywhere, every single day, every moment we make choices, especially if we're making informed choices and we're pulling that information from our previous experience. We're pulling that information and making those choices based on our own personal schema. When I was landing on these predictable color palettes, my brain was not refusing creativity. It was doing its job. It was trying to be efficient. And efficiency has a habit of reusing what already seems dependable. The next part of this that really interested me was the notion of taste. We tend to talk about it as though it rises from somewhere very deep and personal, fully formed and ready to make pronouncements about chartreuse. But taste is built. It develops over time through exposure, repetition, environment, and reinforcement. And usually that is positive reinforcement. After enough encounters with certain combinations, they stop feeling learned and start feeling instinctive. This is where someone like Pierre Bourdieu becomes particularly interesting, and I only just discovered this person when I was researching for this video. But one of his central ideas is that taste is shaped socially as much as personally. It's influenced by class, culture, environment, and the quiet agreements around us about what is refined, beautiful, and correct. That is both fascinating and slightly rude. It also helps explain why the colors I naturally reach for are not random. They are the result of years of seeing certain palettes, liking certain palettes, using certain palettes in my own work, and gradually building a visual language that now feels very automatic. I also think it matters that I don't come from a formal design background. I actually come from a background in education, and I've learned what I know about color through the last 9 years of working with it and experiencing what works and what doesn't, observing, experimenting, and kind of learning and building a foundation from that alone. And it kind of shows up as if it's some kind of an intuitive, instinctive thing, but really it's just the wisdom that we garner from experience. And every so often, I get to add a little bit more structure to that understanding. And I think that matters for people who do not have formal training. You don't have to wait for a credential to become thoughtful about your work. You can build that framework deliberately. You can notice where your instincts are serving you, where they may be narrowing your range, and where you need something more solid to fall back on. A lot of growth starts there. There's another piece to this that I think is worth mentioning because it's very easy to swing too far into the other direction. If working from scratch can feel limiting, kind of like it does for me, the obvious solution seems to be more inspiration. External inspiration. More images, more palettes, more references, more examples. Up to a point, that really does help. It broadens your visual vocabulary and gives your brain more references to work with. But there's also a point where even that starts to break down. When you're exposed to too much inspiration at once, especially with the way we are now, with access to things like Pinterest and Instagram, you're not just seeing more ideas. You're seeing a flood of different points of view all at one time. And that's really ultimately what I believe makes it feel exhausting. There's no shared structure holding these ideas together. There's no common context. No clear boundary. It's just option after option after option, and that's particularly if you're scrolling freely without narrowing down your search. It just stops feeling inspiring and starts feeling overwhelming. It becomes harder to tell what actually interests you, what's even relevant to what you're making, and what is simply noise. Now, that being said, I don't think that the answer is to avoid tools like Instagram and Pinterest altogether. I don't use Instagram, but I do use Pinterest quite often, or other places like that where you can scroll through sources of inspiration. There's a big difference between scrolling through 100 different unrelated palettes and looking through 100 images of desert landscapes. And I've done that before. Often. In one case, you're taking in endless disconnected perspectives. In the other, which is the desert landscapes, you've already introduced a visual and contextual boundary. You might still be looking at a lot of examples, but they're all variations on the same idea. And that, for me, changes everything. Once you narrow the field, your brain no longer has to reconcile 100 competing directions. It can compare within a structure, it can notice patterns, and it can refine the palette. I think that also explains why building a colorway palette for Fiber for the People based on a book or a character from a book or even just a single story altogether can feel so creatively satisfying. The constraint is already built in. You're not responding to everything. You're responding to something very specific, and that specificity gives your decision shape. And what's really interesting when designing a colorway combination from something you can't actually see in front of you, and that the only visual reference you have for that is just images that you've conjured up in your mind while thinking about a character or visualizing a story in front of you, is that you don't have those colors laid out in front of you at all. You have to pull them from the imagery that you have in your mind. And there's something very meta, I don't know, very, I don't know what you would call it. I don't know what that is. It's just something, it's very deep, psychological, metaphysical, I don't know, but it's very satisfying pulling out a color palette from non-visual inspiration. So inspiration in and of itself is not the problem. Obviously, I think inspiration, in the case of me and what I'm noticing, actually works to be the solution. But I do think that too much inspiration that isn't narrowed to some kind of structure or reference, isn't filtered, you could say, can become a little bit daunting and lead to decision fatigue, which absolutely does not help things. And I think that that's really what this whole thing comes down to for me and for you and for anybody who could potentially use a little bit of a pick-me-up when it comes to making creative decisions and feeling like you tend to be landing in a lot of the same places a lot of the time. The goal is not to stop repeating yourself. A recognizable palette, a strong point of view, a style that feels very much like yours, these are all good things. These are all things that you want to attain if you work in some kind of a creative context. The question is whether you're choosing them intentionally or simply ending up there because it's the path of least resistance. That difference matters. I have realized that some of my most interesting color palette combinations for Fiber for the People have come from very distinct sources of external inspiration. I feel like they fill my visual library and they give me a new point of view, one that I would not automatically lean on. And I think it's really powerful for me, and it really helps to freshen up the vibe. It helps me to choose things outside of what I would typically choose so that I can see new possibilities unfold. And that's where I've landed to answer this whole question for me personally. For others, it could be a whole lot of other things. But the point for me is to know when those palettes are emerging intentionally, or when your brain is leaning on those as, like I said, a path of least resistance. Because once you start paying attention to how you make those decisions, not just which decisions you make, you begin to notice where your work feels alive, where it feels automatic, and where it might be asking you for a little more structure, a little more curiosity, or just a little more room to move. Because I'm not lacking creativity. I feel it buzzing inside of me all the time. My brain is simply very good at protecting what it knows already works. And yours is too. And every once in a while, it just needs a reason to explore. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today as I ramble through this. This kind of came up quickly for me as I was building out the collection for Saturday's shop update, and I'm happy I had a chance to ramble about it here. I am going to be talking more in the after show that you can find over on Patreon. It's a great place to go for a lot of additional content. And for today's after show, I'm going to take some simple palettes, just using my embroidery floss. I'm going to create some very simple palettes, the kinds of combinations that I naturally gravitate towards, and then I'm going to push them in directions that I wouldn't normally go, just to see what happens and to see how those small changes can affect the whole thing. And my youngest son, Ronan, who is here for Take Your Child to Work Day, will be present to help us do that. I'm also going to be sharing a few books that I like to lean on when it comes to color inspiration and color palettes, so you're going to want to check that out as well. So definitely meet me over in the after show. Like I said, it's a great way to support the channel. Thank you guys for hanging out with me today. Are you ready to do the after show?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.